Hey, remember that one Bible story where Jesus casts out thousands of demons from a single man, and then they go into pigs and those pigs drown themselves? If you're not familiar with that story, believe me, it's a doozy. And if you are familiar with the story, there's a couple of key significant pieces that you probably missed when you read it in your own Bible. Hi, and welcome back to Learn the Bible with Nathan, where we build a relationship with Jesus one chapter at a time. Today in this episode, we're going over Mark chapter 5. This is the chapter where the demon-possessed man who's possessed with thousands of demons, the demons get cast out and goes into a herd of pigs. And then later in the chapter, a woman is healed from 12 years of bleeding by touching Jesus' clothes. And then Jesus raises a little girl from the dead. And there's some huge significance in the latter two miracles as well. This is a jam-packed chapter. So let's start by reading the first part together. They went across the lake to the region of the Gerasenes. When Jesus got out of the boat, a man with an impure spirit came from the tombs to meet him. This man lived in the tombs, and no one could bind him anymore, not even with a chain. For he often had been chained hand and foot, but he tore the chains apart and broke the irons on his feet. No one was strong enough to subdue him. Night and day, among the tombs and in the hills, he would cry out and cut himself with stones. When he saw Jesus from a distance, he ran and fell on his knees in front of him. He shouted at the top of his voice, "What do you want with me, Jesus, Son of the Most High God? In God's name, don't torture me." For Jesus said to him, "Come out of this man, you impure spirit." Then Jesus asked him, "What is your name?" "My name is Legion," he replied, "for we are many." And he begged Jesus again and again not to send him out of the area. A large herd of pigs was feeding on a nearby hillside. The demon begged Jesus, "Send us among the pigs, allow us to go into them." He gave them permission, and the impure spirits came out and went into the pigs. The herd, about 2,000 in number, rushed down the steep bank into the lake and were drowned. Those tending the pigs ran off and reported this in the town and countryside, and the people went out to see what had happened. When they came to Jesus, they saw the man who had been possessed by the legion of demons sitting there dressed and in his right mind, and they were all afraid. Those who had seen it told the people what had happened to the demon-possessed man and told them about the pigs as well. Then the people began to plead with Jesus to leave their region. As Jesus was getting into the boat, the man who had been demon-possessed begged to go with him. Jesus did not let him, but said, "Go home and to your own people and tell them how much the Lord has done for you and how he has had mercy on you." So the man went away and began to tell in the Decapolis how much Jesus had done for him, and all the people were amazed. Okay, we're going to pause right there, and we're going to do a recap and a deep dive on the first half of the chapter. First of all, this is a crazy story. I think we kind of glaze over some of the facts about this demon-possessed man at the beginning of the chapter. But first of all, we learn that he was often bound with chains and irons on his hands and feet, and he was strong enough to break these chains and these irons and run rampant like a crazy person. When I think about this guy, I think about those people that you might see on a YouTube video that are high on PCP or something like that, running away from the cops, pulling out stop signs, swinging them around, and just causing a bunch of mayhem. This guy is acting a lot like that, at least in my mind. These feats of strength have only really been seen a couple of times throughout the Bible. Most famously, Samson, who was a character from the Old Testament, who was not demon-possessed, he was given the gift of strength from the Lord, and he was able to do things like this. But this particular guy was not blessed by the Lord. He was possessed by a legion of demons, and that's what was making him do these crazy feats of strength. Now, right when Jesus gets off the boat and lands on the other side of the lake, this man runs up to him and yells at the top of his lungs, "What do you want with me, Jesus, Son of the Most High God?" We're going to talk about that phrase here in a second. Now, Jesus casts out the demon and sends them, like the demons requested, into this herd of pigs. The pigs go and get drowned, and then the people from the surrounding areas come to Jesus, and they learn what had happened with this demon-possessed man, and they ask Jesus to leave. The demon-possessed man, or the formerly demon-possessed man, asks to go with Jesus, but Jesus says no and sends him back to his hometown, the Decapolis, to share what the Lord has done with him. Okay, some really cool insights here. Firstly, the first thing that I notice about this encounter with the demon-possessed man is that Jesus lets the demon-possessed man speak. If you remember from previous chapters in Mark, Jesus had interactions with the demon-possessed people, but Jesus would demand that the demon-possessed man would not speak. But in this case, he allows the demon-possessed man to speak. So why is Jesus allowing these demons to speak, but not previous demons? I have a theory on this, and I believe it has to do with where Jesus is located at the time. You see, in Israel, the Israelites have the faith from Yahweh God, and so they're very familiar with what demons are. And so when Jesus was among the Israelites, he didn't permit the demons to speak so that he can establish himself as having authority over these demons. But in pagan or non-Israelite regions in the area, they had a different faith background altogether. You see, on the other side of the Gennesaret Lake, this is generally a Roman-occupied area. Of course, it's all Romanly occupied, but they were pagan god worshippers on the other side of the lake. Right? So when you see a demon-possessed man like this, most likely you are going to attribute his crazy strength and what he's able to do with an act of the pagan gods. Right? You need to remember, back in the pagan world, the idea of having many, many gods was very, very common. Also, the idea of God being good and being pro-person, pro-human, was more of a foreign concept in the pagan culture. So this particular guy who had this crazy strength, it would be very, very easy to surmise that this guy has been given these gifts from the gods, and the gods are angry. And that's why this man is going crazy and cutting himself and breaking these chains. So almost certainly, the people of the region would have attributed what was happening with this man to an act of the gods that they worship, the pagan gods. Okay. Now, when Jesus arrives, the demons come right to Jesus and they proclaim that he is God Most High. So I believe the reason why Jesus allowed these demons to speak was to cast out any doubt of, first of all, who those demons are and who the Most High God is. So anybody who would have been there, actually been present during this, certainly the whole scene would have been shocking, but the first shocking thing would have been what the demons said. In their minds, they would have assumed that the demons or whatever's acting inside this man is their pagan gods. And right away, that is dispelled when the demons say, "What do you want with me, Jesus, Son of the Most High God?" Meaning, they're not gods, Jesus is God. So super, super interesting. I believe the reason why Jesus allowed them to speak altogether was for this reason only. And this kind of tailors into my next question about this story. And the next question that I had was, the demons pleaded with Jesus to not send them out of the area, or firstly, not to send them out of the area, but also not to torture them. Okay. And then Jesus seemed to allow these demons' wishes, right? Now, on first glance, I find this to be quite strange, right? Aren't demons the enemy of both God and of man? Why would Jesus have mercy on these demons? Why wouldn't Jesus say, "I don't care what you want, away from me," right? Instead, the demons ask to go into these pigs, and Jesus allows it. So why would Jesus do that? Okay. First and foremost, we can see throughout the Bible that for whatever reason, and nobody really knows why, but demons or demonic spirits, they want to be inside of a living vessel. Now, why do they want to be inside of a living vessel? I don't know. This is just the way that they're created, and we see that being consistent throughout all the Old Testament as well as the New Testament. So, why the demons wanted to go into pigs specifically was probably simply due to the fact that there were pigs close. I don't think there was anything specific about pigs and why they wanted to go into the pigs. I think the pigs were just in a near proximity to Jesus, so they said, hey, let's go over there. I think that if they were sheep over there, or if they were goats over there, they would have said, send us into the goats. Okay, I've heard some theology about how Jesus allows them to go into the pigs, and pigs in the Jewish culture are considered unclean animals, and so an unclean spirit can go into an unclean animal. I find this to be kind of a surface level observation, and I don't believe it has much weight to it, but there's an interesting argument to be made there. I believe that they went into the pigs simply because pigs were close to them. But that brings us back to the point, why did Jesus allow these demons at all to go into the pig? Why is he having mercy on these demons? Okay, and I think the reason why he allows this is to double up on my first point about how when he lands here, he wants to separate himself as Son of the God Most High from these pagan gods that these people worship, right? Jesus is a God that has mercy on people. He's a God that has grace for people, and he's a God that loves humanity, right? You can't make the same claim about pagan gods or about demons. So I think this was a very powerful display of the difference between Jesus and demons or pagan gods, however you want to classify them, right? And that is that the second he rebukes them from this man and they go into the pigs immediately run into the water and drown themselves. Meaning, this is further cementing the fact that, hey, these pagan gods that you worship, these demons that you worship, they're not for you, and they are not of order. God is a God of order, and these demons worship Satan, or they follow Satan rather, and they are chaos, which is the exact opposite of God. So there's a very physical representation of that when they go into the pigs and the pigs all drown themselves. I think that was the whole point of the reason why Jesus allowed this to happen. Now, of course, a follow-up question that I have is, okay, these demons didn't want to be taken out of this person and then to go into the abyss or go and roam around or wherever demons go when they get cast out. So they went into the pigs, and the pigs drowned themselves, and then they had no place to go after that anyway. So Jesus didn't really accommodate their request. He made a display and then banished them anyways. So that's a little bit interesting. Okay. One big takeaway from this, which I think is super, as I was studying this really kind of came to me last minute, and that is this. Do you remember, we learned this back in Matthew, and we're going to go over this again in a parable later in Mark, but do you remember the parable where Jesus talks about him being a good shepherd, and the shepherd will leave the 99 sheep to go after the one? Right, it's a parable. It's a story about how Jesus is willing to be intentional to go after lost sheep. Okay, so keeping that parable in mind, this whole display of what Jesus is doing in this part of Mark kind of mirrors that. So Jesus was teaching on the other side of the lake, and he was going over parables, the parable of the sower and things like that. He was teaching large crowds of people. And then he gets into a boat and goes totally to the other side of the lake, and he witnesses to one person, literally one person, this demon-possessed man. Okay, and then after he witnesses to this one person, casts the demons out, he goes back over the lake. So literally this entire mission of going over the lake and back over the lake, he only witnessed to one person. It was only for this one person that he came over here. But the impact of that is that he cast out this legion of demon, and this man went back to the Decapolis and shared the good news of Jesus. This man, this demon-possessed man, who was a crazy guy, tearing chains off, cutting himself, yelling and screaming, this man was the first, literally the first witness for Jesus to the Gentiles. He's the first man to bear witness of Jesus to the Gentiles, the very first one. And that's the entire reason why Jesus crossed the lake, was for this one man. And we don't see this specifically in Scripture, but it stands to reason that in later chapters, when Jesus visits the Decapolis and some areas that are not Jewish areas, why he was able to attract a crowd so easily is obviously because of his miracles, but likely it was due to the witness of this one man, which is Really, really, really cool. All right, let's read the rest of the chapter now, starting in verse 21. When Jesus had again crossed over by boat to the other side of the lake, a large crowd gathered around him while he was by the lake. Then one of the synagogue leaders named Jairus came, and when he saw Jesus, he fell at his feet. He pleaded earnestly with him, "My little daughter is dying. Please come and put your hands on her so that she will be healed and live." So Jesus went with him. A large crowd followed and pressed around him, and a woman was there who had been subject to bleeding for 12 years. She had suffered a great deal under the care of many doctors and had spent all she had, yet instead of getting better, she grew worse. When she heard about Jesus, she came up behind him in the crowd and touched his cloak, because she thought, if I just touch his clothes, I will be healed. Immediately, her bleeding stopped, and she felt in her body that she was freed from her suffering. And once Jesus realized that power had gone out from him, he turned around and in the crowd and asked, "Who had touched my clothes?" "You see the people crowding against you," his disciples answered, "and yet you ask, 'Who touched me?'" But Jesus kept looking around to see who had done it. Then the woman, knowing what had happened to her, came and fell at his feet, and trembling with fear, told him the whole truth. He said to her, "Daughter, your faith has healed you. Go in peace and be freed from your suffering." When Jesus was still speaking, some people came from the house of Jairus, the synagogue leader. "Your daughter is dead," they said. "Why bother the teacher anymore?" Overhearing what they said, Jesus told them, "Don't be afraid, just believe." He did not let anyone follow him except Peter, James, and John, the brother of James. When they came to the home of the synagogue leader, Jesus saw a commotion, with people crying and wailing loudly. He went in and said to them, "Why all this commotion and wailing? This child is not dead, but asleep." And they laughed at him. But after he put them all out, he took the child's father and mother and disciples who were with him, and went in where the child was. He took her by the hand and told her, "Talitha cum," which means, "Little girl, I say to you, get up." Immediately the girl stood up and began to walk around. She was 12 years old. At this they were completely astonished. He gave strict orders not to let anyone know about this, and told them to give her something to eat. Okay, so quick recap on what we just read. So we have two major miracles that happen in this section. Jesus comes back to the other side of the lake, and there's crowds everywhere, and a synagogue leader, which this is significant, the synagogue leaders were enemies of Jesus, but in this case, the synagogue leader needs Jesus to do a miracle, so all of a sudden he's got all this great faith. I'm not going to do a deep dive on that, but I think that point is pretty interesting. So the synagogue leader named Jairus, his daughter is dying, and he asks Jesus to come back to his house to heal her. And he says, "Okay, I'll go and I'll heal her." Now he's in a giant crowd, and people are pressing in all around him, and he's pushing to get through this crowd so he can go to Jairus' house. And while he is in this crowd, this woman who has been bleeding for 12 years touches his clothes, and she is healed. Jesus looks around and says, "Who touched me?" The disciples are kind of laughing about it because a million people are touching you. Maybe not a million, but you know what I mean. A ton of people are touching you, but he says that power went out of me. Somebody was healed, and the lady says, "It was me. I was healed." And Jesus blesses her. It says, "That is, your faith is healed. You go and be free of your torment." What an awesome story. And then Jesus learns that this little girl, Jairus' daughter, had passed away. She was dead. But he presses on. He takes Peter, James, and John with him to go see this little girl who was dead. And these people were all mourning this dead girl. And then when Jesus says, "She's not dead, I'm going to go take care of her," they all laugh at him. And then he goes up, heals her, raises her from the dead, and tells no one to share what had happened there. Okay, so breaking this apart, there's a couple of key pieces that I want to do a deep dive into. Okay, firstly, it's very, very interesting. I'm not going to do a deep dive on this fact specifically, but it's very interesting that this lady who was bleeding had been bleeding for 12 years, and she was healed. And also, this little girl who was raised from the dead was also 12 years old. So this is a duality of 12 years. I find that pretty interesting. There's a deep dive you can do there, but we're not going to go there today. What I want to bring to light is the fact that these two miracles back to back happened to ladies. And the second miracle happened to a young lady. Why is that significant? The reason why that is significant is because in the prejudice of the day, historical writers would not have ever written about women. Okay. As a matter of fact, if I was a writer and I was writing a biography of a particular person or a religious text about miraculous events, if I was to include the testimony or the experience of a woman in my writing, I, as the writer, would have been discredited as being a credible writer because you would never include a woman in that kind of testimony, in that kind of story. Rather, if I was a historical writer and there was a major event that happened with a woman, what I would do is either not include that story at all, or I would include that story and I would change the woman to a man, which was incredibly common in that day and age, that the historical writings happened and they would change female characters to male characters. That just shows you how way, way, way ahead of its time these writings were. And even though John Mark, who wrote the book of Mark, would have been discredited or laughed at or ridiculed for including a miracle involving a woman in this text, he included it anyways. And of course, the Bible's blown up as being the greatest book of all time inspired by God. So they did something that's totally culturally opposite of what you're supposed to do, and it was blessed. Right, so that increases the valid nature of the stories that you find in the Gospels, which is really, really cool. Now, secondly, the second miracle, the girl that was raised from the dead, not only was she a woman, but she was also a child. So same kind of rules apply to children. And we've seen this in previous chapters where the disciples are always sending children away. But Jesus says, let the children come to me. So the same applies. If I'm an author and I write about a miraculous event happening to a child, that would totally discredit me as an author, right? I would either not include that story at all, or I would change that story to the child being a young man or something like that, okay? In this case, she is both a woman and she is a child. That's like double jeopardy of what you should never write about if you are writing a religious text nearing that time period. But John Mark does, increasing the credibility, once again, of the Gospels. Okay. And the last little thing that I'll mention here, and we're going to talk about this more in a later episode, but when Jesus went and performed this miracle on the young girl, he took Peter, James, and John with him. A couple episodes ago, we talked about how Jesus had an inner circle of his closest and best friends. And those were Peter, James, and John. Peter, James, and John will also be with Jesus when he goes up on top of the mountain and Elijah and Moses appear from heaven, but we're going to talk about that story at a later time. But once again, reiterating the fact that Jesus, even though he has lots of different followers, he does have his close and best friends, just like I do and just like you do. I think my biggest takeaway from this chapter was from the story of the demon-possessed man. And I love thinking about it from the angle of the fact that he is no longer in an Israelite territory, he is in a pagan territory, and the way that he handles demons is different in that region because that is going to bring greater glory to God. In this case, he allowed the demon to speak, which is a really cool angle that I had never known before doing a deep dive on this chapter this time around. Thank you so much for listening to this, the end of the episode. I totally appreciate you coming along the ride with me. The next chapter, or the next episode, we're going to go over Mark chapter 6. I'm really excited for that episode. Lots of things that Jesus does in that episode that will blow your mind, so stay tuned for that. But until then, Jesus loves you, and shalom, shalom.